There, we said it. We got it wrong.
It was ignored and ridiculed for years. But TOG II is actually much better than you think. It was a tank designed for a specific purpose, boasting innovative features and representing a significant engineering achievement. The traditional story is that it was an anachronism. A World War I tank built for World War II by a bunch of old men who didn't understand the world had changed.
And yes, hands up. This is a view that the Tank Museum itself has perpetuated in the past. But recent research has changed the narrative. And now TOG is one of the most famous vehicles in the museum, even though it never fired a shot in anger, never actually saw active service.
Inspired by TOG's newfound fame in video games, researchers have begun to dig deeper into the history, motivations and lessons from the TOG II project.
And this gives us an entirely different perspective. Far from just being a pointless wartime experiment, TOG II incorporated some revolutionary design concepts that set it apart from every other tank project.
So, we need to look at TOG II again, inside and out, and appreciate it for what it is, understand what it might have done, and find out if it'll ever run again.
I can't say this often enough. TOG II is huge. It's over 10 metres long. It weighs 80 tonnes. That is more than Jagdtiger or Tortoise. 114 millimetres of frontal armour, more than Tiger I, and a massively powerful 28-pounder gun. But who built it and why? The 1939 Ministry of War specification for the TOG project was for a heavy assault tank. And this was a tank that needed to be able to cross shell-pocked and waterlogged ground, to get across a 16-foot wide gap, to climb a 5'6" obstacle, and to survive hits from a 47mm anti-tank gun and a 105mm howitzer at 100 yards, which in tank terms is absolute point-blank range. It was a hefty brief to fulfil, the likes of which had never been done before. There would be a good many challenges along the way, but the brief was met. And this is the ultimate result.
The team assembled to fulfil this brief called themselves the Old Gang, as they'd been responsible for most British tanks in World War I. Led by Sir Albert Stern, who was the driving force behind the development of the tank, the group was loaded with talent and experience, including engine specialist Harry Ricardo and Walter Gordon Wilson, who's probably one of the best ever gearbox and transmission designers.
These guys knew what they were doing, and their brief evolved with the situation on the battlefield. Now, early on, they weren't alone in thinking that this second war might involve a return to trench warfare.
In his papers, Stern makes a lot of references to Flanders mud, and his early proposal for TOG features side sponsons and has no turret. This is so it could use an unditching beam when it became stuck, all just like a First World War tank. But as soon as it was clear this wasn't going to happen, the concept was dropped, along with any idea that this new war would require an old-style tank. Instead, the Old Gang would be tasked to produce something we'd never built before, but we would need if we were going to take the fight to the Germans and win the war.
It becomes obvious when you look at the spec. This is not a tank built for a previous war. 16 feet, that's not the width of a trench, it's the width of a concrete lined anti-tank ditch. And 5'6", that is the height of a dragon's tooth anti-tank obstacle. This weight of armour is what you'd need to survive sustained and concentrated enemy fire. And this sort of firepower is what you'd need to smash fortifications.
This tank was designed to break through the Siegfried Line, the belt of fortifications and anti-tank obstacles that Germany had built along its border with France and Belgium. At this point, this seemed the most direct route into Germany, which is where the war would need to be won.
Far from being a bunch of tired old engineers looking for a job, the Old Gang had been assembled to fulfil a challenge the likes of which no one had done before. And given their skills and qualifications, they were the best people to do it.
Given its size and weight, arguably the most innovative feature of TOG II is found in its propulsion, a diesel-electric drive. This was cutting-edge technology at the time, a diesel engine powering a generator, which in turn powered two electric motors, which drove the tracks.
This was first seen in the old gang's first attempt, TOG I, of which only this gun now survive.
This was something that no other British tank had tried or operated with at this point, being ahead of the far more celebrated engineer, Ferdinand Porsche.
The advantage of diesel-electric is that it didn't need a gearbox. Not that there was a gearbox in existence at that time that could shift TOG I's 75-ton weight anyway.
Delivered in September 1940, TOG I arrived just after the fall of France. But it shows how the old gang were far from complacent in the way they tackled the brief. The French too had been considering heavy assault options with their proposed char de fortress, which could be considered TOG's cousin. In fact, the old gang had visited their French counterparts in the early months of the war. And this is how a French 75mm gun, the same as was fitted to the French Char B, ended up in TOG I. But getting a tank of that weight across anti-tank ditches and dragon's teeth was never going to be easy. And unsurprisingly, this new engine had a number of issues. The arrangement with a single generator put too much strain on the electric motors and tracks to work effectively. A later attempt at a fluid drive, using a hydraulic coupling to the engine instead of a flywheel, was also a failure, and the vehicle was relegated to use as a test bed before being eventually scrapped.
By mid-1940, the old gang had started work on this, TOG II.
They solved these problems, reducing the strain on the system by using two generators, one for each motor, instead of one trying to power both.
The engine is a Paxman Ricardo V12. That gives 600 horsepower. That's about the same as the Kharkov V2 on a T-34 or the Maybach HL210 on a Tiger. But here, it doesn't power the tracks directly. It runs two generators that in turn power two electric motors back at this end that run the tracks.
Steering is done via a potentiometer that varies the power to each track when the steering wheel, there are no sticks like most tanks, is turned. The system also eliminates the need for a conventional transmission and gearbox, as drive is supplied straight to the tracks via the sprocket wheels.
So having built what remains one of the heaviest tanks of all time, the old gang had successfully designed from scratch an engine and a drivetrain to power it.
And it wasn't as slow as you might think. In trials, it seems to have been able to move at around 8 to 12 miles an hour, and cross-country mobility, particularly obstacle crossing, seems to have been good.
There's no doubt that dual power is a very innovative solution, but it's also very complex, and given the strain that it's under, there's an awful lot to go wrong, and it often does.
This is exactly what Ferdinand Porsche discovered when his VK4501 dual-power Tiger design was rejected for its propensity to catch fire. It was reworked to become the Elephant, but at 65 tons, Elephant still isn't nearly as heavy as TOG.
The drive powers these huge 32-inch wide tracks. Now, the track arrangement is very important. There is enough length of track in contact with the ground to cross a wide obstacle, but they're also canted up at the front, and that enables the tank to climb something like a dragon's tooth anti-tank obstacle as per the requirement. But this tank, now termed TOG II Star, was retrofitted with torsion bar suspension. Now, that is something you only normally find on heavy German armour, and in this particular case, this is the first and only British tank to have the system. This was added in when engineers at Foster & Company, who were the builders, pointed out that vibration during running was causing damage to the mechanical components of the tank.
One common piece of nonsense that's been talked about TOG in the past is that because it's so long compared to its width, and the length of track on the ground is so great, it would have been unable to steer. This is complete rubbish, because in the film we have of the tank on trials, it steers perfectly well.
So, in conclusion here, we can say the old gang had met the very demanding spec for mobility. In its role as a heavy assault tank, TOG would be expected to absorb a heavy weight of enemy fire, and consequently, it's heavily armoured. But that does, of course, contribute to its massive weight. The frontal armour is 114mm thick. Down the sides, it's 75mm, and then at the rear, it's 50mm, although that is cemented armour over mild steel. But the interesting thing is that the larger components, the big armour plates, are designed to be removable. And that makes them easy to repair in case of damage. And because of the bolt-on construction, the tank was actually quick and economical to build. These side doors are not part of the original design. To start off with, there was going to be a sponson, like a First World War tank in this gap, with twin Beeson machine guns to cover the side of the vehicle. When they abandoned that idea, they were going to slot in a big lump of armour plate, and when even that didn't happen, they put these things in. They're not very thick, they wouldn't provide much protection. In fact, they just about keep the rain out, to be honest. TOG II's armour was thicker than anything else out there in 1941, and it was proof against anything except the 88mm KWK-36. So on protection too, it seems the old gang had met the brief. This is a big gun to match the big requirements for TOG II. But for years, the Tank Museum misidentified it. This isn't a 17-pounder, and this is not a Challenger turret. There, we said it. We got it wrong. This wasn't the first turret and gun TOG II had been fitted with, either.
In trials, TOG II seems to have been fitted with a bewildering variety of turrets, mostly dummies, before finally this current combination was fitted. So what gun is it?
It's a 28-pounder. Now that is a type of gun that never entered production. Only 2 prototypes were built, and Stern claimed they were built to his specification. What it actually is a composite. It's a 28-pounder barrel, which is based on the barrel of a 3.7-inch anti-aircraft gun, a 17-pounder anti-tank gun breech, and a 17-pounder muzzle brake. And that visual element is where the confusion arises.
The 3.7-inch heavy anti-aircraft gun was, like the German 8.8cm flak, a highly effective weapon. But unlike the 88, no real attempt was made to adapt it for anti-tank use. Although it was experimentally tried out on an anti-tank carriage, nothing came of it. It did, however, form the basis for 2 experimental tank guns, the 28-pounder on TOG II and the 32-pounder fitted to TOG's near neighbour, the Tortoise heavy assault tank.
The 28-pounder would penetrate up to 116mm of 30-degree angled rolled homogeneous armour at up to 1,000 yards. And it was described to Churchill as being at least as good as an 88. So I think we can assume that when it comes to firepower, the old gang had nailed it. So while we're in here, in the fighting compartment, you can see there's quite a lot of space, but the whole thing is there'd be a crew of 6 in here, so it would still be fairly crowded. Up there you have the gun breech, 17-pounder gun breech, but of course it is a 28-pounder gun. And then the turret basket itself, this is the elevation gear, which is partly detached, and then underneath the turret basket is the traverse gear. It's slightly difficult to tell what all of these 6 crew members would have been done. I mean, some are sort of self-explanatory. Here's the driver's position. That is not the original seat. I don't know where that came from. And he would, of course, it's not like a normal tank. You don't have steering levers. You have a steering wheel that, as we said, operates the potentiometer that varies the current to the track on either side. Driver has got a co-driver. You've then got the gunner. You've got a loader. There's no ammunition racking in here. That hadn't been fitted, I don't think. But then you've got an extra odd bod commander, and then there's this other guy, 6 crew. I'm not quite sure what he does. Although, of course, if the machine gun sponsors had been fitted in this hole here, that would have given him more than enough to do, because there'd be a pair of Bisa machine guns either side. It's not fully fitted out, but do remember this was an experimental vehicle, and for a lot of the latter part of its life, it was actually being used as a test rig. I'm afraid there's also, it spent quite a lot of time outside. There's a fair bit of corrosion. It's stable at the moment, but you can see there's quite a lot of old corrosion, particularly on things like the turret basket, which has been painted over. So in terms of mobility, protection and firepower, the old gang had taken a nearly impossible brief and turned it into something tangible. So why didn't it enter service? We'll look at those things shortly, but in the meantime, if you're enjoying this video, please leave us a like. It means a lot to us, and it feeds the algorithm. It means we can reach new audiences with educational videos like these.
Hypothetical questions are a minefield, but it's not impossible to imagine a squadron of TOG IIs pounding away at the Siegfried Line at the head of an Allied army punching its way into Germany.
It certainly seems to have fulfilled the specification. It's well on its way to becoming a viable project when it was wound up in early 1944. There are a number of factors involved in this.
In the second half of 1943, the impetus to design a heavy assault tank was waning, as it became obvious that other tanks, like the Churchill, would be more useful and versatile in a more mobile form of warfare. This line of thinking proved accurate when the Siegfried Line was breached with far more ease than had previously been expected.
These concentrations of mechanised might are the answer to the best schemes of Germany's engineers.
But the final blow came from enemies that Albert Stern had made in the Ministry of Supply, his paymasters. Stern was really quite temperamental and difficult to deal with.
He made an enemy of the future government minister, Duncan Sandys, who shut TOG down in favour of his own pet project, another heavy assault tank, Tortoise. Which just goes to show that even in 1944, the concept of a heavy assault tank, TOG's operational requirement, was still thought valid in some circles. As with Tortoise, TOG II would have been beset by transportation difficulties, being reliant on an operational rail network for movement. It's often asked how TOG would have performed against enemy heavy tanks, such as Tiger II and Jagdtiger.
We can't be certain, but we do know that TOG was not designed to fight other tanks. It wouldn't have the necessary mobility. The 28-pounder would potentially have been very good, but the traverse and fire control systems weren't up to it either.
In short, it's still fair to argue that TOG was a failed design, because it was never accepted for service. So even though it's far more innovative than we've given it credit for in the past, it's never going to have a historical significance of something like Sherman or Churchill.
But it's still just as famous, now more so than ever.
Let's be clear. Until video games like World of Tanks made TOG and other strange vehicles like FV4005 famous, hardly anyone was interested in them at all. When it arrived at the Tank Museum in the 1950s, it was simply a relic of a failed programme. As a result, it wasn't put inside the museum alongside its wartime contemporaries, because visitors wanted to see Shermans, Churchills and Panthers. So it was placed outside, where it sat in the elements. It was only moved inside in the late 1980s when this hall was built. But still, no one really paid it any attention.
About 20 years ago, it was pushed sideways on a layer of washing up liquid by a Chieftain armoured recovery vehicle. And it was pushed into that corner. That was to make space first of all for a cafe and later for this soft play area. That's how it wound up in its current rather undignified and often criticised position.
But then, not long after, something amazing happened. In December 2012, TOG II appears in World of Tanks.
Within a few months, it was famous, and this quiet corner of the museum became a hotspot. And suddenly we have people wondering why such an important vehicle is in such a bad position. With growing interest came increased curiosity and a desire for more information to fill the gaps.
It's amazing that a video game has had such a powerful impact on how people understand and interact with our collections. And that this has given rise to an entirely new appreciation of the vehicle is also remarkable.
The good news is that there are plans afoot to redisplay TOG II. But I'm afraid the bad news, the thing we're often asked is, will it ever run again? And I'm afraid that the answer to that is no.
It would be amazing. But from all its years in the elements, its engine is seized solid and it's mechanically incomplete. The cost of putting it back into running order would be gigantic, and the process would destroy a lot of the current originality of a unique vehicle. So we'll just have to content ourselves seeing it in action on the virtual battlefield. The most fitting way to remind us of its dramatic rise from irrelevance to prominence, which itself has been the driver to help us understand and appreciate the huge accomplishments of the old gang. We'd like to give a particular thank you to Andrew Hills. It's his work on TOG II that actually revolutionised our understanding of the subject. What do you think about TOG II and the old gang? Let us know in the comments below. And also, if you enjoyed this video, you'd probably enjoy this one and this one. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.